The opioid epidemic is, I would say, at this point, one of our greatest public health challenges in this country. Over 70,000 people died of an overdose in 2017. And that was the most ever recorded in American history, much greater than even the number of deaths due to HIV/AIDS at the peak of that epidemic in 1995. So the magnitude in terms of mortality is overwhelming, to say the least. We now know that much of the origins of this epidemic are in the pharmaceutical industry and in prescribing of opioids to levels that I don't think anyone had ever anticipated. We see pharmaceutical companies, manufacturers pushing these medications, marketing them very aggressively, and trying to expand, basically, the market share of these drugs to conditions where such strong pain medication normally wouldn't have been necessary. That just exposes a vast number of people to these. At the same time in the 90s, there was a push on physicians to think of pain as a fifth vital sign and to treat pain very aggressively. And this, at the time, was what many physicians pulled off the shelf to do that. And now we're seeing the outcome of all of those come together. So unfortunately, the medical community, pharmaceutical companies ultimately, I think, created this crisis, and now it's just manifested to levels that I don't think many people actually expected.
The fact that the world needs forms of renewable and clean energy is no secret. Fossil fuels pollute and cause environmental damage. Moreover, they are running out fast, so we need alternatives. One such alternative can be wind energy. Wind energy has already made a vital contribution to our energy needs. The windmills of our forebears have been transformed with modern technology into the electricity behemoths that are helping to power the grids of countries all over the world. The advantages of wind power are many and compelling, but here are some aspects of wind power production that cause concern. There is no denying that wind turbines produce noise, and if you live near them, this may be a problem. The sound they produce can travel, some estimate up to 2 kilometers. Another disadvantage of wind power is that wind is not constant. In fact, it fluctuates both in strength and direction.
The man who coined the term vegan is Donald Watson, and that was in England in 1944. Before that, vegetarianism was, something that was related mostly to religious beliefs and spiritual beliefs, and also a notion of healthism, like perfecting the body, which was often promoted by sort of religious advocates. Donald Watson wanted to distinguish between people who were eating meat and the people who were eating eggs and dairy, and he felt that we should not consume any animal products, not just dietary, but also wool and other byproducts, leather, etc. And so he coined that term in 1944. And by that term he meant a lifestyle that encompasses, avoiding any harm to other beings. That's the origin of the term vegan. In the 1970s and 1980s, in England and then increasingly in the US as well, veganism became part of what's known as the animal protection movement or the animal rights movement, and it became like a means to an end. In order to help animals, people would adopt a vegan diet. And what's happening now is veganism is emerging and sort of being disassociated from that to some extent and becoming its own distinct, what I call, lifestyle movement.
While you might find yourself wondering why my memory is so bad, forgetting is part of life and people forget surprisingly fast. Research has found that approximately 56% of information is forgotten within an hour, 66% after a day. The reality is that while the brain is capable of impressive feats, its capacity to store and recall details is limited. There are different reasons due to which we forget things. To start with, have you ever felt like a piece of information has just vanished from your memory? Or maybe you know that it's there, but you just can't seem to find it. This inability to retrieve a memory is one of the most common causes of forgetting. Sometimes people forget due to a phenomenon known as interference. Some memories compete and interfere with other memories. When information is very similar to other information that was previously stored in memory, interference is more likely to occur. One of the differences between social network sites and text messaging is that social network sites are public or semi-public. So you might be having a conversation with one person through, say, status updates and comments, but there are a lot of people who are potentially listening. And that changes the dynamics a little bit. One option on a site like Facebook is to put people into groups or lists, so you're actually targeting specific people, and this may be increasingly done as Facebook develops. However, research suggests that people don't necessarily want to do that, either because they don't trust the technology or because it's not nuanced or sophisticated enough. So people will adopt other strategies to address certain people. So for example, you might use song lyrics or references to events or to people, so that certain people are excluded and other people realize they're being talked to. Another strategy is to tag people in photos, even when it's not a photo of them, and I think that's part of that sort of attempt to carve out your own little community within the social network sites. And what we're looking at is how people use language choice to target particular people. So they will choose to use one language or another. So English is often used to target a wide audience across language groups, but multilingual speakers will then use local languages to target specific groups within that.
Yellowstone became the first national park for all to enjoy the unique hydrothermal and geologic wonders. The broad array of habitat types found within Yellowstone contributes to a high diversity of bird species, including many whose migratory travels bring them back to the park each year from winter journeys south. Yellowstone National Park forms the core of the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem, one of the largest nearly intact temperate zone ecosystems on Earth. Greater Yellowstone's diversity of natural wealth includes the hydrothermal features, wildlife, vegetation, lakes, and geologic wonders like the Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone River. An amazing experience awaits you here. In spring, plowing begins and roads and services open for the season on a staggered schedule. Records of bird sightings have been kept in Yellowstone since its establishment in 1872. These records document nearly 300 species of birds to date, including raptors, songbirds, shorebirds, and waterfowl. Approximately 150 species nest in the park. Yellowstone is as wondrous as it is complex.
To study the conditions that promote delay of gratification or being satisfied, the American psychologist Walter and his colleagues designed an experimental test, in which a child is asked to choose between a larger treat, such as 2 cookies, and a smaller treat, such as 1 cookie. After stating a preference for the larger treat, the child learns that to obtain that treat, it is necessary to wait for the experimenter to return. The child is also told that if he or she signals the experimenter will return and the child will receive the smaller treat. Thus, the smaller treat is available now, but the larger treat requires waiting. To get the larger treat, the child must resist the temptation to get an immediate treat. That experimental situation has proven very useful both in demonstrating the importance of the ability to delay gratification, and in identifying strategies that make it possible for children to delay gratification. Children who were best able to wait in that situation when they were 4 years old are more socially and academically successful as high school students, and earn higher SAT scores. The situation, adapted for adolescents and teens, also revealed that middle and high school students who can wait a week for a monetary reward earn higher grades, show less problem behavior in school, and are less likely to use cigarettes, alcohol, and other drugs than their peers who choose not to wait.
We're looking at fat tissue, in particular, to see what controls how much fat people accumulate. We know that the more fat you have, the more detrimental that is to health. What we're able to do in a lab is take fat cells and grow them in the lab and see how they behave. We're quite interested in how natural steroids affect how fat tissue behaves. So we can see if you give steroids to fat tissue, whether they accumulate more fat and see how this changes their behavior. The idea is that if we can understand exactly how steroids work on fat tissue, we can design treatments that might help prevent people become overweight or obese. and perhaps reduce their risk of things like diabetes, which we know is quite related to exactly how much fat tissue you have. The other thing we're very interested in is where you have fat tissue, because not all fat tissue is the same. So fat tissue stored within the abdomen itself is much worse. Fat tissue around organs really does increase your risk of developing things like diabetes quite dramatically. On the other hand, if you store fat just underneath the skin, that's actually a much better place to store fat. If we can understand where this fat is stored, we can try and design treatments that selectively reduce one fat tissue deposit as opposed to another.
People are aging. There are a lot more people in the older generation who are living longer, but not necessarily staying healthy for a large part of their lives. We're trying to understand factors that contribute to the quality of their life. My current research is mainly looking at factors like stress and how it affects our immune system. So what I'm quite excited about is looking at older people and factors that are important to them. For one, we're looking at bereavement, or in other words a state of sorrow, and how that affects the immune system. Often after older people have had a bereavement they go quite quickly downhill themselves, often from pneumonia. So we're trying to understand, how does bereavement affect a particular cell that is good at fighting off pneumonia? Another thing that we're doing is we're looking at hip fracture in older people, which is again another common event, and we're trying to understand the impact of depression. Often people in hospital with a hip fracture develop depression, and these are the people that then go on to become frail a lot more quickly than others. They get infections, often these infections lead to death. We're trying to slow down that progression to frailty. If we can understand how these factors interact more, then we actually start doing something about it.
Is coin tossing truly random, or it's just our ignorance over the physical parameters? A famous mathematician began to study instances of change, questioning whether the things we think we know are, in fact, true. Like the coin toss, for example. Most people assume the toss of a coin is always a 50-50 probability, with a 50% chance it lands on heads, and a 50% chance it lands on tails. But our mathematician believes that the coin toss is not about probability at all. It is about physics, the coin, and how the tosser is actually throwing it. The majority of times, if a coin is heads up when it is flipped, it will remain heads up when it lands. Our mathematician has even trained himself to flip a coin and make it come up heads 10 out of 10 times. A similar effect is seen if the coin is spun. Because of the way most coins are made, the heads side can weigh more, which means it will fall on that side, leaving the other side up more often. Further, some magicians will have coins that are shaved, giving more weight to one side. It's possible to make things random. If you flip a coin quite vigorously, it's as close to being a fair event, 50-50, as I know, if you flip it and catch it on your hand. However, we usually don't do them vigorously. If you think about it the least little bit, you'll realize it's not random at all. In fact, there are people around carnivals who have been able to flip a coin and keep control over it. The point? It's not magic at all, it's math.
Well, people might be surprised to know that actually, our experience of taste begins extremely early, and in fact, it begins in the womb. For example, when a pregnant mother eats a very garlicky dinner, her fetus also experiences that garlicky taste within the amniotic fluid. So there are a variety of flavors that do pass through into the uterine environment and actually have been shown to affect babies' acceptance of those flavors after they've been born. Exposure is the way that we learn to like things. The evidence seems to suggest that that exposure can start in the womb. There are also some genetic differences in our ability to taste specific tastes, particularly bitter tastes. These are often quite obvious when you look at individual children and their willingness to try, for example, green vegetables. So there will be some children for whom, green vegetables might not be their favorite things, but they will accept them. And others who, for example, behave like you're trying to kill them. Those children are what we call super tasters, and they have a genetic predisposition to taste the bitter chemicals that are present, particularly in green vegetables, and will therefore of course find it much less easy to accept those kinds of vegetables into their daily diets.